The Kraveth Dominion had catalogued 11,000 starfaring civilizations in its long march across the galaxy. 11,000 fleets measured, ranked, and filed away by tonnage, weapon yield, and hull count. Size was law. Size was truth. A species with more ships simply won, and a species with fewer simply learned to kneel. So when the sensors aboard the Dominion flagship Ashaka's Wrath detected a human battle group of only 12 vessels drifting near the contested Veyrin Corridor, the bridge crew did not sound alarms. They laughed. 12, said Fleet Marshal Doran Cothres, swirling the word in his mouth like something sour and amusing. 12 ships to hold a corridor we approach with 200. His tactical officer, a younger Kraveth named VSK, zoomed the viewscreen in on the human formation. The ships were small, boxy, almost crude compared to the elegant spinal architecture of Dominion cruisers. No grace, no presence. Just 12 gray shapes sitting in the dark like stones someone forgot to clear from a road. Shall I hail them, Marshal? Offer them the mercy of retreat. Offer them nothing, Doran said. Let them see what real strength looks like. Let them learn, as all the others learned. Word of the tiny fleet spread through the Dominion ranks before the first shot was ever fired. It became a joke passed between crews on comm channels. Have you seen the human toy fleet? 12 ships. 12. We could sneeze and sink them. Even the historians back on Kraveth Prime, cataloging the coming battle for the archives, had already titled the file, The Corridor Formality. Because that was what this was supposed to be. A formality. A brief, one-sided demonstration before the humans withdrew their pathetic dozen ships and ceded the corridor, as every other overmatched species had before them. Nobody on the Dominion side thought to ask a more important question. Why would 12 ships hold their ground against 200, unless they knew something the Dominion didn't? Aboard the human flagship Resolute, the mood was very different from panic. Captain Elena Voss stood on the bridge, arms folded, watching the Dominion armada bloom across her tactical display like a slow, spreading bruise. 206 ships. Her officers had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't fear so much as focus. They think we're insane, said her XO, Commander Tobias Reyes, reading the enemy's open comm chatter that translation algorithms were still piecing together. One of their officers just called us the toy fleet. Let them, Elena said calmly. Confidence is a currency. They're about to spend all of theirs at once. She turned to her weapons officer. Status on the corridor net? Fully seated, Captain. 90% grav mine saturation across the approach vector. They don't know it's there. Their scanners aren't tuned for our signature masking. Good. Elena allowed herself the smallest smile. Then let's teach them what humans learned the hard way. A long time ago, you don't measure a fight by who has more ships. You measure it by who understands the battlefield. The Dominion fleet surged forward in a grand, arrogant crescent formation. 200 ships spreading wide to encircle and annihilate the tiny human line in a single, glorious pass. Marshal Doran watched from his command chair, already composing the victory report in his mind. Then the corridor lit up. Not with human weapons fire, not yet. With gravity. Dozens of Dominion ships on the flanks staggered as invisible mines, seated weeks earlier under cover of a supposed trade convoy, detonated in synchronized bursts of crushing gravitational force. Engines failed. Hulls buckled. Entire squadrons that had been sailing in perfect formation moments before were suddenly tumbling, disabled, adrift. Report, Doran barked, gripping his armrest as the bridge shuddered from the shockwave. 31 ships disabled, Marshal. It came from inside the corridor. They seeded it before we ever arrived. VSK stared at the tactical display, and for the first time, his amusement curdled into something colder. They knew we were coming. They knew our approach vector. They planned this encounter before we ever gave the order to advance. Impossible. We selected this corridor at random. Did we? VSK's voice was quiet. Or did they make sure it was the only corridor that made strategic sense? What followed was not a battle in the way the Dominion understood battles. It was something more like a lesson, delivered patiently and precisely. The 12 human ships did not charge forward into the chaos they had created. They held position, picking off crippled Dominion vessels with surgical strikes while the rest of the armada floundered in confusion, still recovering from the trap. Every human maneuver seemed to anticipate the Dominion's next move a full step in advance, because it did. Elena's crew had spent 3 years studying Dominion engagement patterns from a dozen prior first contact skirmishes across neighboring systems, quietly gathered through Allied intelligence networks. They knew the Dominion's formations because the Dominion had used the same formations, unchanged, for centuries. They're not fighting us, Doran realized, watching his fleet unravel piece by piece. They're conducting us. Like an orchestra. It was in that moment, watching his flagship's own targeting systems fail to lock onto human vessels that kept slipping just outside predicted firing solutions, that Marshal Doran Cothres understood something no Dominion officer had understood in 11,000 prior campaigns. Size had never been the variable that mattered. Preparation was. Patience was. And humans, this strange, small, endlessly underestimated species, had both in terrifying abundance. 3 hours after first contact, Doran gave the order every Dominion officer dreaded and none had ever needed to give before: full withdrawal. As the shattered remains of his armada limped back across the corridor, he opened a private channel to the human flagship, static crackling with the weight of the moment. "Captain," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier condescension. 12 ships. You held 200 with 12 ships. Elena's reply was calm, almost gentle. "We didn't hold you back with 12 ships, Marshal. We held you back with 3 years of watching, waiting, and refusing to be underestimated twice. The ships were just the last part." There was a long silence on the channel. "Your species," Doran finally said, "measures strength strangely." "No," Elena replied. "We just measure it completely." Back on Kraveth Prime, the historians quietly renamed their file. The corridor formality became simply the 12, a case study taught to every cadet who ever again made the mistake of counting hulls before counting minds. And across 100 worlds that had once dismissed humanity as small, fragile, and few, a new understanding began to spread, slow, humbling, and impossible to unlearn. They had laughed at the tiny fleet, and for the first time the galaxy understood what it truly meant to be human.